Cecilia Roberts had a problem, and the problem was this: she could not say no. Not to the extra shift when the other maid fell ill with a fever on the worst possible evening. Not to the desperate friend who needed covering for an errand she should never have agreed to run. Not to one final glass of very good French champagne during the servants' celebration at Thornwick Hall, when the wine was warm and golden and the whole world felt softer at its edges. And definitely, catastrophically, not when Mary, the upstairs maid with the sharpest tongue in 3 counties, leaned across the long kitchen table and dared her, you, sensible, careful, boring Cecilia, who has never flirted with anyone in her life, to flirt with the first gentleman she met tonight. Everyone laughed, because everyone knew Cecilia would never. She opened her mouth to say no, and then Mrs. Foley appeared in the doorway with a tray and a sealed bottle, and the words that would change everything: East Wing, 3rd floor, Blue Suite, refreshments, immediately. Cecilia took the tray. She always took the tray. And if you have ever made one small wrong choice that somehow set every other thing in motion, then you already know what happened next. Stay with me, because this story is about to get very complicated. The champagne made the 3rd floor staircases look remarkably similar. She climbed the wrong one. She turned left where she should have turned right. She passed a portrait gallery she did not recognize, moved down a corridor hung with dark green drapes she had never once seen in 3 years of working at Thornwick Hall, and found herself standing in front of a door that looked, in the thin light of a single-wall sconce, exactly like the door of the Blue Suite. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She pressed the door open. The room beyond was extraordinary in a way that rooms should not be when you have wandered into them by accident. A fire burned high in the hearth, casting everything amber and shadow. The ceiling was impossibly tall. The furniture was dark mahogany and leather, massive and masculine, built for permanence. The bed against the far wall was enormous, hung with deep burgundy curtains, and beside it, draped over the back of a chair with the casual elegance of something left by someone who expected the world to hold still until he returned, lay a perfectly pressed shirt of fine white linen. Cecilia set the tray on the side table. She stood very still. Outside, rain had begun against the windows, hard and cold. She was wet from an earlier errand in the courtyard. Her uniform was damp at the hem and shoulders. Her hair had come half loose from its pins. The room was warm, wonderfully, absurdly warm, and she was so tired, tired in the bone-deep way that comes from months of early mornings and late nights, and never quite catching up. And the champagne had made everything feel slightly unreal, and the shirt was right there, soft and white as new paper, and the room was empty. She made the first disastrous decision. She changed into the shirt. It fell to her thighs. The sleeves rolled back past her elbows. It was soft against her skin in a way her own worn chemise had never been. The way things are when they are made for someone who has never had to think about cost. She draped her damp uniform over the fire screen to dry. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, just to rest, just for a moment, and the pillows smelled of cedarwood and something clean and cool and entirely unfamiliar. She closed her eyes. She made the second disastrous decision. She fell deeply, completely, disastrously asleep. She woke to light, pale grey autumn light filtering through half-drawn curtains, and the faint smell of coffee, and the sound of a fire burning low, and a voice, low and unhurried and absolutely not the voice of an empty room, saying good morning. Cecilia's eyes flew open. She sat up so fast that the shirt fell entirely off one shoulder. A man sat across the room in the leather wingback chair near the window. He was fully dressed, dark coat, white cravat, every inch of him composed and deliberate. He held a cup of coffee. He was watching her with an expression she could not read. He was, and this was the first coherent thought her mind managed to produce, the most extraordinarily handsome man she had ever seen in her life. Not handsome in the easy, comfortable way of men she had known. Handsome in a way that felt dangerous. Strong jaw, dark hair no longer than his collar, eyes so dark they were nearly black, a stillness to him that was not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of immense leashed control, the way a river holds still at its surface while moving with enormous force underneath. He set down his coffee cup. "You are Lady Charlotte Kensington," he said. It was not a question. She opened her mouth. She closed it. And then, because she had had too much champagne the night before, and because she was still half asleep, and because she was Cecilia Roberts and had never in her life managed to say the sensible thing at the critical moment, she said the one thing a maid wearing a stolen shirt should never say to a duke. "You are more handsome than everyone claimed." There was a pause. Then Duke Nathaniel Vaughan, the most controlled, most feared, most socially immaculate man in England, a man whom the entire county had agreed never smiled, did something that no one would have believed if she had tried to tell them. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a contained aristocratic exhale. A real laugh, brief and genuine, reaching his eyes, softening every hard line of his face into something startlingly, achingly human. Cecilia stared at him. He looked at her for a long moment after the laughter faded, and something shifted in his expression, something that settled and sharpened and went very quiet, the way a man's face changes when he has just seen something he did not expect and does not quite know what to do with yet. "To Thornwick Hall," he said at last, with a faint wondering note in his voice, as though greeting a strange new weather. And somewhere down the corridor, someone who had been watching the east stairs since dawn was about to make everything considerably worse. Lady Charlotte Kensington caught Cecilia at the bottom of the servants' staircase before the household was fully awake, caught her by the arm with a grip that was very much at odds with her delicate appearance, and pulled her into the shadow of the linen corridor. "I saw you leave," Charlotte said, through barely parted teeth. "I know those stairs. They lead only to his suite." Cecilia opened her mouth and closed it twice before anything useful came out. "It was an accident," she said, in a voice that she was aware sounded exactly like someone who had done something on purpose. "I got lost. The room looked empty. I only meant to deliver the refreshments." "You were wearing his shirt," Charlotte said. The silence that followed was the most expensive silence Cecilia had ever stood inside. "I can explain," Cecilia said. "You don't need to explain," Charlotte said. "I need to think," and that was the moment Cecilia would understand later, when she should have planted her feet and refused, should have said clearly and finally that she was going directly to the Duke to correct the misunderstanding, that she was a housemaid from Yorkshire who had wandered into the wrong room after too much champagne, and that whatever complicated situation Charlotte Kensington found herself in, it had nothing to do with her. She should have said that. She almost did. And then Charlotte's face did something very strange. The fury drained out of it. Something raw replaced it, something young and frightened and entirely unguarded in a way that Cecilia had never seen from Lady Charlotte, who was always composed, always graceful, always performed. Charlotte pressed one hand briefly over her mouth, as though keeping something in. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with tears she was refusing to shed. "There is something you don't know," Charlotte said quietly. "Something no one in this house knows. Sit down." They sat in the small room where the house linens were stored, surrounded by stacked sheets and the smell of lavender and cedar. And Charlotte told the truth. His name was Elliot Holey, a painter, the son of a country solicitor from a village 20 miles away. He had come to paint the countryside 3 summers ago, and Charlotte had met him at a local exhibition her mother had dragged her to, and he had argued with her about the quality of light in a particular landscape. And she had argued back, and they had talked for 2 hours while her chaperone dozed in a corner chair, and by the time she left she had known, with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally found the thing they did not know they were missing, that she was in love. They had corresponded for 3 years, carefully, in secret, through a trusted friend. The engagement to Duke Nathaniel Vaughan had been arranged when Charlotte was 16, Contracts sealed between families built on property lines and social alliances, finalized before Charlotte had any voice in the matter. She had never fought it openly. She had looked for quieter exits, a diplomatic delay, a way to convince her father the match was unsuitable without openly defying him. She had found nothing until now. "I need time," Charlotte said. "Elliot needs time. He has a commission, a significant one, and if it succeeds he can come to my father with something real. But I need more time before this engagement becomes permanent. And you," she said, looking at Cecilia with something that was half apology and half desperate calculation, "you have already given it to me without knowing it. He mistook you for me. He has never seen my face. Not once. Only a miniature portrait painted when I was 17. He has no way of knowing you are not me." Cecilia stared at her. "I am a maid," she said flatly. "I know what you are," Charlotte said. "I know how to be me. I will tell you everything. I will manage the household staff. My father is in London until the end of the month. My mother has a sick headache most of the day, and the Duke has never met me." Cecilia looked at the fear behind Charlotte's careful composure, the desperate hope, the way her hands gripped each other in her lap, tight enough to go white at the knuckles. She thought of every person she had ever been unable to say no to. She thought of how spectacularly that tendency had always served her. And then, because she was Cecilia Roberts, and she had never once in her life managed to look at someone drowning and walk away, she said, "You have 3 weeks." And then, because Charlotte's expression had shifted into something she was clearly building toward, Cecilia added, "That is all." Charlotte nodded and then said the last part. "He needs to decide he doesn't want to marry me. He needs to choose not to proceed. You need," Charlotte said clearly, "to make him hate you." The silence in the linen room was absolute. "You want me," Cecilia said with great care, "to spend 3 weeks with the most terrifying man in England, pretending to be you, while actively trying to make him despise me." "Yes," Charlotte said. Cecilia looked up at the ceiling. The lavender smell pressed around her. Somewhere above them, on the 3rd floor of Thornwick Hall, Duke Nathaniel Vaughan was beginning his morning, drinking his coffee, reading his correspondence, perhaps thinking about the strange girl who had woken in his shirt and told him he was handsomer than advertised. No, Cecilia thought, absolutely not. "All right," she said. Agnes, Charlotte's lady's maid, dressed Cecilia for the midday luncheon with the expression of a woman who had been told not to ask questions and had elected not to feel emotions about this policy either. She pinned Cecilia's dark hair into a style that was almost right. She laced her into a day dress of pale blue muslin that was almost a perfect fit. She regarded Cecilia's work-roughened hands with extreme professional suffering and said nothing whatsoever. Cecilia descended the main staircase of Thornwick Hall with the careful steps of someone walking into battle wearing shoes that did not quite belong to her. He was already in the drawing room. He stood near the tall windows overlooking the garden, hands clasped behind his back, posture so straight it might have been cut from stone. In the full daylight he was somehow more striking than he had been that morning, and that morning had already been a great deal to manage. He wore black and grey, perfectly fitted. In profile his face was all clean decisive lines, jaw, cheekbone, the line of his brow, and he held himself with the absolute stillness of a man entirely at ease with power. He turned when she entered. His gaze moved over her once, quick and thorough, polite and entirely unreadable, and then he crossed the room toward her with quiet measured strides and bowed. "Lady Charlotte," he said, "I hope the morning found you well." His voice was lower than expected, unhurried, as though every word he chose had been considered before being released into the air. "Very well, Your Grace," Cecilia said, with the precise degree of composure she had rehearsed on the stairs. "And yourself?" "Better than yesterday," he said, and there was something in his voice, the faintest edge of dry amusement, and when she looked up his expression had not changed, but his eyes had. She felt heat climb her neck. "I owe you an apology," she began. "For this morning it was entirely—" "No apology is necessary," he said. I was told Thornwick Hall is a complex house. I am inclined to believe it." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that might, in someone less controlled, have been called curious. "You expected someone different," she said before she could stop herself. A pause. "I expected someone I had read about," he said. "Correspondence is a particular form of unreality. The person who writes is never quite the person who speaks." "How," she said carefully, "do you find the difference?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her, and then he said, with the same low, unhurried certainty, preferable. She had absolutely no idea what to do with that. If you are enjoying this story so far, go ahead and subscribe right now, because what happens next between Cecilia and the Duke is the part nobody sees coming. Lunch was a trial by etiquette that Cecilia navigated with the grim determination of someone crossing a river on stepping stones, aware that every step might be the one that sends her into the water. She knew broadly which fork to use. She knew not to speak with food in her mouth. She knew to keep her voice low and her posture straight. What she had not anticipated was how closely he watched, not intrusively, not obviously, but she kept catching his gaze across the table, calm and steady, taking notes on something she could not identify. Every time she made a minor error, took the wrong spoon, laughed too quickly at something Lord and Kensington said, used her bread to mop the last of the sauce in a way that was extremely satisfying, but apparently not fashionable, she saw something flicker in his expression. Not disdain, amusement. It was extraordinarily unnerving. After lunch, when Lord Kensington was called away to speak with his steward, and Charlotte's mother retired with a renewed headache, Cecilia found herself standing in the corridor with nowhere particularly safe to go. Nathaniel fell into step beside her. "I understand there are riding paths through the Western estate," he said. "I am told the views are notable." "They are," she said. "Very. I wondered if you might be willing to show them to me tomorrow morning." She should have invented a prior engagement. She should have said headache, letter, appointment, anything at all. She looked up at him instead, and his dark eyes were steady on her face, and she heard herself say, "Yes, of course." The corner of his mouth shifted barely, imperceptibly, and he said, "Good," and walked away down the corridor. Cecilia stood very still in the hallway of Thornwick Hall and thought, "This is a terrible idea." And then, more treacherously, she thought, "I meant it." Charlotte listened to the report of the luncheon with the expression of someone receiving very bad medical news. "He likes you," she said flatly. "He was polite," Cecilia said. "Nathaniel Vaughan is not polite. He is either indifferent or interested, and indifference looks much colder than what you are describing." Charlotte began to pace the small sitting room they had retreated to. "The riding excursion is perfect, actually. Plenty of opportunities to appear unsuitable. You need to be spoiled, demanding, shallow. He values composure above everything, so be chaotic. He values dignity, so be undignified. He values intelligence, so be vacant." "I understand the assignment," Cecilia said quietly. She understood it perfectly. She simply already had the terrible feeling that it was not going to go the way Charlotte imagined. The riding excursion did not go the way Charlotte imagined. Cecilia arrived at the stables determined to be spectacular in her unsuitability. She demanded the most difficult horse. She announced loudly that she found the western path tedious and would prefer something with better scenery. She complained at some length about the quality of the morning light. Nathaniel listened to all of it. He did not respond with irritation. He asked the groom to bring a steadier horse, which he suggested she might find more comfortable. He agreed about the eastern path and turned his horse without comment. And when she, determined to escalate, kicked her horse forward too sharply and nearly pitched sideways at the first gate, he was beside her in an instant, close enough that his knee brushed hers, one hand steadying the reins she had fumbled. "Sit back," he said quietly, close to her ear. "Weight in the heels, not the toes." His hand did not linger. He moved back to his own horse immediately. But she felt the warmth of his nearness for the rest of the morning. She had not made him hate her. She had received a riding lesson. The second evening brought a small dinner of local families. Cecilia arrived prepared. She interrupted a conversation between Nathaniel and Lord Petton about railway investment to declare that she found finance deeply tedious and could not understand why anyone voluntarily discussed it at dinner. Lord Petton spluttered. Nathaniel looked at her. "I agree," he said. "Most dinner-table conversation about finance is theatre rather than substance. The real conversations happen in offices." He glanced at Lord Petton. No offence intended. Lord Petton took considerable offence. Nathaniel did not appear to notice. "What would you discuss at dinner?" he asked Cecilia with that low, unhurried note, as though her answer genuinely mattered. She had not prepared for that. "Books," she said, the honest answer arriving before she could stop it. "Or people. What people are actually like beneath what they show." He was quiet for a moment. "That is," he said, "a considerably more interesting topic." He shifted his chair a fraction of an inch in her direction. Lord Petton was talking to the woman on his left. Nathaniel said, quietly enough for only her, "What are you, beneath what you show?" She looked at him. The candlelight was warm on his face, softening the strong lines, and his eyes were very dark and very direct, giving nothing away while somehow asking everything. "I am not," she said carefully, very well practiced at pretending. Something moved in his expression. "I know," he said. She felt cold, but he had turned back to the table and the conversation moved on, and she could not be certain what he meant. The afternoon tea disaster was, objectively, her finest work. Charlotte had coached her thoroughly on what not to do. Cecilia proceeded to do all of it, spectacularly. She spilled tea, not a small, graceful spill, but a proper catastrophic spill that crossed the white linen cloth and caught the edge of Lady Pembridge's sleeve. She apologized so rapidly and so comprehensively, and at such tremendous length, that Lady Pembridge's expression shifted from offence to helpless amusement. She knocked a plate of finger sandwiches off the table, reaching for more napkins. She retrieved the sandwiches from the floor with such genuine, mortified horror that the youngest Miss Pembridge began to laugh, which made her mother laugh, which broke the tension in the room entirely. Nathaniel was not at the tea, but he had clearly been informed, because that evening when Cecilia passed him in the corridor outside the library, he said, "I understand this afternoon's tea was eventful." "I spilled on Lady Pembridge," Cecilia said. "I heard," he said, and there was that imperceptible twitch of the corner of his mouth. "She told my valet she hasn't laughed that hard in 3 years." Cecilia stared at him. "You are," he said, with something that was not quite teasing and not quite warmth, but occupied some private territory between the two, remarkably consistent. "You make the room better by existing in it, regardless of what you knock over in the process." He walked away into the library. She stood in the corridor and thought, "This man is going to be the ruin of everything." He began to look for her. That was the thing Cecilia noticed first. Not in any obvious way, not in a way that could be pointed to and named precisely. But she found him in places she had not expected. Near the garden when she crossed it at 11, at the bottom of the main stairs when she came down from above, at the end of the library corridor, apparently absorbed in a newspaper. At precisely the same time she arrived there every other afternoon. He arranged his days in her direction. She could see it clearly. She also knew what it meant. It meant she was failing the assignment. At a family dinner 4 days into the visit, with the Kensingtons' cousins in attendance, Cecilia launched into a carefully prepared speech about the absurdity of arranged marriages. She was articulate. She was pointed. She was, she felt, quite compelling. Nathaniel was quiet through all of it. When she finished, slightly breathless and waiting for offense, he said, "I agree entirely." The table went silent. "The practice is antiquated," he said, in the same level, unhurried voice he might have used for a comment about the weather. "It treats human beings as items to be traded rather than people capable of judgment. I have never understood why it persists among families who claim to love their children." Cecilia looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was very steady and very calm, and somehow very complicated all at once. Then, "Why," said Charlotte's aunt, who had gone rather pink, "are you here, Your Grace?" Nathaniel was quiet for a beat. "Because I gave my word," he said, "and I honor my word. But I am willing to be persuaded." He looked at Cecilia when he said it. The library was where she surrendered. Charlotte had said, "You need to be vapid, brainless. He values intelligence. Take it away." Cecilia spent an evening in the Kensington Library, pretending not to have read anything. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. Nathaniel found her there, looking for a particular atlas, and instead found her standing in front of the history shelves with her hands behind her back, studiously not reading anything. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. He looked at the shelves and then at her. "You've read the Wilberforce," he said. She followed his eyes to the volume she had been unconsciously facing, its spine a fraction of an inch forward from where she had touched it. "I glanced at it," she said. "The pages are worn differently at the second and third chapters," he said. "Someone read those sections many times." He tilted his head. "What did you think of his argument about social obligation?" The fight was brief and valiant and entirely lost. She told him exactly what she thought about Wilberforce's argument. She told him with more heat than was probably appropriate. She disagreed with one of his central claims, and said so and explained why, and was halfway through her third point when she remembered she was supposed to be vapid. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled watchfulness, not the dry amusement, something younger and lighter and almost wondering. "You know," he said when she stopped, "most people agree with whatever I say. I imagine that's tedious," she said. "You have no idea," he said quietly. He sat down in the chair across from her. He stayed for 2 hours. Charlotte received the report of the library evening with an expression of absolute despair. 2 hours, she said. He asked good questions, Cecilia offered. "Charlotte," he stayed for 2 hours. Charlotte pinched the bridge of her nose. "You are the worst saboteur in the history of England." "I am trying," Cecilia said. "Are you?" Charlotte said. She looked at Cecilia very steadily. "Because from where I stand, it looks very much like you are having a rather lovely time in my library with a man you are supposed to be driving away." Cecilia opened her mouth and closed it. She could not, in honesty, deny that the library evening had been, in spite of everything, one of the nicest evenings she had spent in a very long time. What Cecilia did not know in those weeks was what was happening in the room she could not see. On the 8th day of his visit, Nathaniel had been working at the desk in the morning room when he heard 2 maids talking in the garden below the open window. Their voices carried up clearly on the still autumn air. "Never seen Lady Charlotte so different. Has she been in France? She's been ill. Something to do with nerves." "Ill." She looked perfectly well at tea. Lady Charlotte never touched cake before. Never. She ate 3. Of them's a pause. "She does look different, though. Something about the hands." He had looked up from his papers. He had gone very still. Later that same day, he had seen her in the servants' corridor, where Lady Charlotte had absolutely no reason to be, crouched beside a young boot girl, untangling a length of ribbon that had caught on a brush. She had not seen him. The expression on her face while she worked, careful, patient, warm, entirely focused on the task and the person in front of her, was not the expression of a woman performing kindness for an audience. He had gone back to his room. He had sat for a long time with what he knew. He was a man who had spent his entire life being lied to, gracefully, deceived carefully, managed and maneuvered, and positioned by people who wanted things from him. He recognized the shape of deception. He also recognized, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was entirely unlike anything he had encountered before, because what she was doing was not taking, she was giving. She had agreed to something that cost her, and she was doing it with such genuine, unperformed awkwardness and warmth and accidental honesty that he had found himself, on the 8th day, making a decision that he could not have entirely explained. He went to find her at the east garden wall, where he had noticed she came most mornings to look at the view before the household woke. He did not say, "I know you are not Charlotte Kensington." He said, "The light is good this morning." She said, "Yes, it is." And he chose, with full knowledge, to say nothing more, because by the 8th day it no longer mattered who she was pretending to be. He had already found out who she actually was. The riding lessons became a genuine routine. What had started as Cecilia's sabotage attempt had transformed into mornings she caught herself looking forward to in a way that made her feel slightly panicked. He was a patient teacher, not indulgent, but precise. "Do this, not that. Wait here, hands lower." He did not praise unnecessarily, and he did not soften corrections. But when she got something right, when her posture clicked into place, or she took a gait cleanly, he said so, briefly, without fuss, with the same flat certainty he used for everything else. She found herself working harder in those mornings than she had ever worked for praise she had been given freely. One morning, 11 days into his visit, she cleared a narrow hedge line she had been trying for 3 days. She pulled up her horse and turned, laughing real laughter surprised out of her, and found him already watching her from 20 yards back, his horse still, his expression wearing something she had not seen before, something quiet and private that had nothing to do with the riding. He rode forward. "Well done," he said. 2 words, the most ordinary possible words. She felt them settle somewhere in her chest like something warm and permanent. That was the moment she understood she was in real trouble. The fireplace conversations were worse. In the evenings, when the household retired, Nathaniel sometimes appeared in Charlotte's mother's sitting room, formally, with the door open and a housemaid visible in the corridor. Nothing improper, nothing that could be named or questioned, just conversation by a fire in the dark, warm quiet of an autumn evening. He told her about his childhood on his 4th visit, not the public record of it, not the titles and estates and accomplishments. The truth of it. A father who valued precision and composure and never once indicated that either of those things were expressions of love rather than simply requirements. A house, Ravenscar Court, enormous and beautiful and almost entirely silent. Brothers who died young. A mother who painted badly in a room at the back of the house and who had shown Nathaniel once, when he was very small, what color looked like when someone chose it freely rather than because it was expected. She had died when he was 12. He told this without sentiment, but she heard beneath the composed delivery what the sentence actually contained, the specific compound loneliness of a person who had learned very early that people left. Cecilia sat across the fireplace from him and thought about the girl she actually was, a housemaid, the daughter of a seamstress from Yorkshire, someone who had grown up in a 2-room cottage and learned to read from borrowed books, and she thought about how very much she wanted to take his hand. She did not. She was not supposed to be making him love her. She was supposed to be making him hate her. But the fireplace conversations had taken on a warmth she did not know how to stop, and she had begun to dread the moment when Charlotte's 3 weeks ran out, and she had to leave them behind. 3 weeks became 4. Elliot's commission had hit a delay, something to do with the patron, a rescheduled viewing, and Charlotte had come to Cecilia with red-rimmed eyes and a voice stretched thin and asked for 1 more week, just 1. Cecilia had said yes, because she always said yes, but the weeks were costing her something she had not budgeted for. She missed him when he was not in the room. This was new. This was something she had no framework for. The way a room felt different when he was in it, not safer, not warmer, sharper, somehow more itself. The way a painting only becomes a painting when the light is right. She recognized what she was doing. She recognized it clearly and continued doing it anyway, because she was apparently incapable of self-preservation when it came to Duke Nathaniel Vaughan. On the 16th day of his extended visit, Charlotte's cousin Victor Clark arrived for the weekend, young, handsome, easy in manner, and he sat beside Cecilia at dinner and talked with great animation about music and made her laugh 3 times. She did not notice Nathaniel watching. Victor did not notice Nathaniel watching. But Charlotte did from across the table, and afterward she found Cecilia in the corridor and said, with a slightly alarmed expression, "The Duke watched Victor Clark for the entire dinner like a man calculating something uncomfortable." Cecilia frowned. "He's very composed." "He is not composed when he looks at Victor Clark looking at you," Charlotte said flatly. "He looks—" Charlotte paused, possessive, in a very quiet, very controlled, very alarming way. Cecilia thought about this for too long. The warmth that moved through her when she thought about it was another piece of evidence she filed away under the heading, "This is getting entirely out of hand." The near kiss happened on the 18th day. She had been walking back from the garden in the early evening, later than she intended, the path half dark and the air sharp with cold. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her and turned, expecting one of the footmen. Nathaniel was there. He had come from the stables, she could tell from the coat, and he looked more himself in riding clothes than he ever did in the severe, formal black of dinner, less armored, more human. He fell into step beside her without explanation, as though they had arranged to walk together, as though this was simply something that happened. They walked in silence for a moment. "You're cold," he said. "I'm fine. You're shivering." She was in fact shivering, not entirely from the cold. He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. They were in the narrow part of the path where the yew hedges grew close on either side, and the sky was a deep fading blue above them. And in the silence between them, she could hear the distant sound of the house and the closer sound of her own heartbeat. He looked at her. The quality of his silence was different from other people's silence. It was not empty. It was full of something he was deciding whether to say or to do, or whether to cross the last careful distance that still existed between them. She looked up at him. He was very close. "Charlotte." A door opened at the end of the path, one of the underfootmen carrying a lamp, calling Charlotte's name for dinner. They stepped apart. The space between them reassembled itself. She turned and walked toward the house and concentrated very carefully on the gravel under her feet, and did not look back and did not breathe properly for approximately 10 minutes afterward. "One more week," Charlotte said that night. "I know," Cecilia said. "One more week, I promise. After that it's done one way or another, and I will tell my father myself." Cecilia thought about the path and the fading blue sky and the almost closeness of a man she was not supposed to want. "One more week," she said, and went upstairs and sat in the room that was not her room and thought about all the ways she was completely, irreversibly in love with a man she was going to have to destroy. If this story is making your heart hurt a little, go ahead and share it with someone who needs a good romance today, because the next part is going to make it hurt considerably more before it gets better. The ball transformed Thornwick Hall in 48 hours. Candles everywhere, white chrysanthemums and deep red dahlias, chandeliers rehung with new crystal, floors polished to a mirror finish. Charlotte supervised Cecilia's preparation with anxious precision. The gown was ivory silk, simple in structure but extraordinary in quality, the kind of fabric that moved like water and caught light like a flame. Agnes dressed her hair with real skill. Charlotte herself added a strand of pearls at her throat that had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother. When Cecilia looked at herself in the glass, she did not see herself. She saw, for the first time, something close to what Charlotte saw when she imagined a future she had never wanted. A woman made for ballrooms, a woman made for silk and candlelight and fine dinner parties. It made her feel strangely, specifically sad. "You look beautiful," Charlotte said from behind her. "I look like a lie," Cecilia said quietly. Charlotte said nothing. He saw her the moment she entered the ballroom. She felt it before she saw it. The quality of attention in the room shifting, the air rearranging itself around a new point of focus. She turned and found him standing near the far windows, talking to Lord Kensington, and his gaze had moved from his host to her in the instant she appeared, and did not move again. The room glittered and hummed, 36 people in their finest clothes, the chandeliers blazing, the musicians tuning in the corner, all of it existing at a slight remove, as though the ballroom were a stage, and Nathaniel and Cecilia were the only people in it who were actually fully present. He crossed the room toward her. The crowd parted, not obviously, just the subtle rearrangement of people who understand instinctively that certain movement takes precedence. He stopped before her and bowed. "Lady Charlotte," he said, and then very quietly, with only she close enough to hear, "You look remarkable. You've seen me in considerably less favorable conditions," she said. His mouth curved. "Yes," he said, "and you were remarkable then too." She felt the words land somewhere underneath all the silk and the pretense. "Will you dance?" he asked. The waltz was slow. The musicians had chosen something old and formal that demanded nearness, that made the distance between two people's bodies a matter of careful public negotiation. His hand was at her waist. Her hand was in his. He was an extraordinary dancer, smooth and precise and utterly confident, and she understood, following him, that this was a man who did everything he did with full commitment or not at all. She concentrated on her steps. "You're counting," he said. "I'm not. You are slightly. Your lips move." She looked up at him, outraged, and found him watching her with that nearly invisible warmth that lived only in the corner of his expression. She stopped counting. She let him lead. The music moved them in wide, slow circles, and the rest of the room blurred at the edges, and she was aware only of his hand steady at her waist, and the warm, grounding weight of being held by someone who's held her like something worth keeping. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it under the music. "That this is the best possible version of an impossible evening," she said honestly. His hand at her waist shifted, barely fractionally, drawing her a breath closer. "Yes," he said, quiet and certain. "It is." The garden afterward was dark and silver under a full autumn moon. She had come out for air. He had followed, naturally, inevitably, in the organized, deliberate way of a man who did not follow people without intention. At the end of the U corridor, a stone bench and an old dry fountain. She sat. He sat beside her, not close enough to alarm anyone who might appear, but close enough that she was acutely aware of the warmth of him, of the way the cold night made that warmth feel more specific and more precious. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I agreed to come to Thornwick Hall," he said, "I believed I was honoring an obligation, a contract made when we were both too young to have been properly consulted. I expected to behave correctly, to assess the suitability of an arrangement, to proceed or not with appropriate composure." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not expect," he said, "to meet someone who made me feel that I had been living at the wrong temperature for years and had not noticed until now." Cecilia's hands were still in her lap. She could not speak. He turned and looked at her in the moonlight, the full weight of his gaze undisguised for once, stripped of the controlled watchfulness. "I am saying this poorly," he said. "You are not," she managed. "I have," he said slowly. "I believe I have completely ruined my peace." He stopped. "You have," she said. "And I find," he said, "that I don't want it back. The moonlight, the garden, the silk of the dress that was not hers, the strand of pearls at her throat that were not hers, the name she had worn for weeks like a coat belonging to someone else." She leaned forward slightly. He leaned forward slightly. The distance between them was a breath less. His hand came up slowly and carefully, and his fingers brushed her jaw, turned her face the last small fraction toward him. He kissed her, soft at first, tentative in the way of someone who has waited a long time and is slightly afraid of having waited in vain. But she answered. She could not help it, and it stopped being tentative. It was not reckless. It was not sharp and burning. It was something more destructive than either of those things, warm and earnest and full of everything neither of them had said. When she finally pulled back, her hand was pressed against his chest and she could feel his heartbeat through the layers of coat and waistcoat. "We should go in," she whispered. He said nothing, but his hand came up to cover hers against his chest, brief and deliberate, and then he released her and stood, and she could see in his face exactly what it cost him to do so. On the other side of the ballroom, half hidden behind the door to the music room, Charlotte Kensington watched with wide eyes and a white face, and understood that everything had just become enormously, irreparably complicated. Charlotte appeared in Cecilia's room before sunrise, still dressed, eyes red, hands slightly unsteady. "My father returned early from London," she said. "He arrived late last night. He knows about Elliot." Cecilia went very still. "He's called for a meeting with Nathaniel this morning. He wants the formal engagement announced by the end of the week. He wants everything finalized." The word finalized dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Elliot will lose everything," Charlotte said. "If my father investigates, and he will, Elliot's commission falls through. His reputation in London is gone before it begins. He has nothing to protect him." Her voice was very controlled, in the way of a person using everything they have left to stay composed. "I know I have asked too much already. I know this has cost you things I didn't account for. But Cecilia, I am asking one last time. End it tonight. Whatever it takes." Cecilia was quiet. She thought about the garden and the moonlight, and his hand over hers. She thought about Charlotte, who had spent 3 years loving someone in secret. She thought about Elliot Holey, the painter from the country, who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a woman whose family considered him insufficient. She thought about how completely, thoroughly, devastatingly she had failed at every attempt to make Nathaniel hate her, and she thought about the fact that he had kissed her last night in a moonlit garden, knowing exactly what she was, and then she thought, "This time I cannot fail." "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not. She found him in the library. He turned when she entered, and something moved in his face at the sight of her, the small private recognition, the warmth he no longer tried to contain in her presence. She forced herself to look at it fully, to understand precisely what she was about to destroy. "We need to speak," she said. He heard it in her voice. She saw him hear it, the faint change in his stillness. He sat last night, she began. "I don't regret last night," he said. "I do." The words were precise and clear, and she had made them so on purpose, and she watched them land, and she would have given everything she owned not to see what they did to his face. Nothing visible. That was the terrible part. He controlled it perfectly, but she saw in the single instant, before control arrived, what lay beneath it. "I see," he said. "This whole visit," she said, and her voice was steady. She was keeping it steady. "I have been allowing something to develop that I should have stopped immediately. It was wrong of me. The garden was a mistake." She made herself hold his gaze. "I am in love with someone else. I have been for some time." "One specific person," he said. "Yes, and this is not a convenient excuse." "No," she said. Another silence, longer. The library was very quiet. The morning light was grey and flat through the tall windows. "Then everything between us," he said, and his voice was absolutely level. She could hear nothing in it at all. "Has been what precisely?" "A mistake," she said. "On my part. I am sorry." The last 2 words came out slightly less steady than she intended. He stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anger. He looked at her for one long moment with an expression she could not read at all, and then he said very quietly, "I appreciate your honesty." He walked out. That was the most devastating thing he could have done. Be gracious. Be composed. Give her precisely the dignity she did not deserve. She sat in the empty library and pressed both hands over her face. She did not cry. She could not afford to cry. She had a job to do, and she had done it, and it was done now, and that was what mattered, and she had always been very good at honoring her agreements. She sat there until she was certain she could walk through the house without her face giving anything away. Then she went to find Charlotte. He left Thornwick Hall the next morning. No announcement, no formal farewell. His carriage brought around at 7. She heard it from the window of the room that was not her room, the room she should not have been in, and the household gathered briefly in the entry hall, and Lord Kensington shook his hand and said something. And then Duke Nathaniel Vaughan walked out of Thornwick Hall without looking back. Charlotte stood at the upstairs window and watched the carriage go. Cecilia stood in the corridor behind her, and felt the specific cold of a house from which something warm has been permanently removed. "It's done," Charlotte said softly. "Yes," Cecilia said. "Cecilia." "Don't," she said. "Not right now." She kept her voice very even. Charlotte was quiet. Cecilia went down to the servants' level, changed into her own uniform, picked up the morning supply lists, and began her work. She was Cecilia Roberts, housemaid. She had always been Cecilia Roberts, housemaid. Everything else had been a borrowed coat. She folded it up. She put it away. She worked. 3 weeks later, she discovered the truth. She was in the linen corridor, her own territory again, the stacked sheets and the lavender smell, the world that was actually hers, when she overheard 2 of the upstairs maids talking in the next room. One of them was describing something she had heard from a housemaid at the Pemberton estate, who had heard it from a groom who had been at the tavern with Nathaniel's valet the night before the Duke left Thornwick Hall. The valet apparently had said, "His Grace has known for weeks since the 2nd week." He knew she wasn't Lady Charlotte. Cecilia's hands stopped moving on the linen. He said, "The valet said the Duke found out and just kept going. Kept asking her to ride and talking to her in the library and all of it. Knew the whole time. Knew she was no lady. Then why didn't he say something?" "That's the thing, isn't it?" the second maid said. "Valet says he'd never seen His Grace like that before. Says he was happy, and that whatever she was, he didn't want to stop." The maids moved on. Cecilia stood in the linen corridor for a very long time. He had known since the 2nd week. He had looked at her, Cecilia Roberts, the maid, the Yorkshire girl with roughened hands and borrowed dresses, and he had known exactly what she was, and he had arranged his days around her. Anyway, he had sat with her by the fire, he had taught her to ride, he had stayed 2 hours in the library, he had kissed her in a moonlit garden knowing the truth, he had chosen her with full knowledge, and she had looked him in the face and told him she loved someone else. She sat down on the floor of the linen corridor among the folded sheets and the lavender smell and pressed her hands over her face. "This time," she cried. He had withdrawn from society in a way that England noticed. Duke Nathaniel Vaughan, who had appeared reliably at Parliament, at club dinners, at country house parties and London social gatherings for the past decade, had closed the doors of Ravenscar Court and stopped appearing anywhere at all. Invitations went unanswered. Letters received no reply. Parliament noted his absence. Rumours circulated. He was ill. He was travelling. He had suffered some financial crisis. He had taken a mistress. Nobody knew the real answer. Nobody except Cecilia Roberts, who was mopping a corridor at Thornwick Hall with a heart made of broken glass and shame in equal measure, and who knew exactly why he had gone. Charlotte found her one evening in the servants' garden, a small plot behind the kitchen block where the cook grew herbs, and sat beside her on the wooden bench without announcement. "You know?" Charlotte. "Yes," Cecilia said. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "Don't be. You got what you needed." "That isn't." Charlotte started again. "I knew after the library night that something real had happened. I told myself it didn't matter because it couldn't be real regardless. You were a maid. He was a duke. The whole thing was impossible. I told myself that made it acceptable to push forward." Cecilia looked at the kitchen garden. The rosemary had gone woody. Someone should trim it. "I told myself," Charlotte said quietly, "that you would recover, and he would recover, and everyone would be fine. I needed to believe that because the alternative was admitting I had used someone I care about as a weapon." A long pause. "He knew," Cecilia said finally. "I know he did. From the 2nd week. He knew what I was and he chose to stay." She stopped. "He loved me. I think he actually loved me." She could not finish the sentence. Charlotte reached over and took her hand. "Go to him," she said. Cecilia was quiet. "Charlotte, you think it's impossible. I know. I spent 3 years thinking the same thing about Elliot, and what that got me was 3 years of secret letters and misery when the answer was simply there in front of me, waiting to be chosen." Charlotte's grip on her hand was firm. "He knew you were a maid. He knew what it would mean. He chose you anyway. The only question is, whether you are going to let the world's ideas about impossibility be louder than what you actually know. Cecilia stared at the rosemary. She thought about the linen corridor and the cold floor and the thing she had felt when she finally understood what he had done. Not just the sacrifice of his own surprise, but the deeper choice it represented, to see someone truly and to want them anyway. To set aside every expectation you had been raised inside and choose a specific person instead of the world's idea of who that person should be. She had told him she loved someone else. She had told him everything between them was a mistake, and he had been gracious. He had been composed. He had said, "I appreciate your honesty," and walked away and closed the doors of Ravenscar Court and broken quietly in the specific way that quiet men break, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply and alone. "I don't know if he'll see me," she said. "He will see you," Charlotte said with certainty. That is not the man who vanishes and locks the door when the person he loves comes to find him. "How do you know?" Cecilia said. "Because I watched him," Charlotte said simply. "For weeks at my own table, in my own drawing room, in the garden and the library, I watched a man look at someone the way I look at Elliot, which is the way people only look at one person ever, and I knew it for what it was. He is not over you. He is not going to be over you." She squeezed Cecilia's hand once. "Go," she said. Ravenscar Court was 4 hours north of Thornwick Hall on the edge of the moor. She arrived in borrowed travelling clothes in a hired coach on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when the moor was grey and vast, and the sky pressed down low with the weight of coming rain. The house was immense, beautiful in the way of things built to last centuries. Stone walls gone silver grey, tall windows, a long drive lined with bare-limbed trees. It sat at the center of its landscape like something that had been there always and would be there always, indifferent to the smallness of individual lives moving through it. The butler who answered the door regarded her with the expert blankness of a very well-trained servant. "My name is Cecilia Roberts," she said. "He knows who I am." The butler regarded her for a long moment. Then he said, "Please wait in the hall." He came back in 7 minutes. "His Grace will receive you in the study." The study was at the back of the house, looking out over the moor, a wide, low window with nothing before it but miles of open, rain-dark land. Books everywhere, a fire, a desk. He was standing at the window when she was shown in. He turned. The 7 weeks since she had last seen him had done something to him. Not age, not illness, something quieter, a settling of the careful distance he kept between himself and the world, as though he had moved several more inches inside it and reinforced the walls. He looked at her the way she had looked at the moor from the carriage window, recognizing a landscape that was familiar and altered both at once. "Miss Roberts," he said, "not Lady Charlotte, not the borrowed name, her real name." He had known all along, and now he was saying so clearly, directly, and she understood in that single moment that this was not going to be simple or painless, but that it was the only thing left to do. "Yes," she said. "That's yes. I'm sorry I let you say that name for so long." "I'm not," he said. "It told me things about your character that were more important than the name itself." The room was very quiet. Outside, the first rain was beginning. She could hear it against the window glass. "You knew," she said. "From the 2nd week." "Yes, and you said nothing." "No, why?" He was quiet for a moment. He had turned fully from the window. He was facing her now, arms loose at his sides, no desk between them, no formal furniture to mediate. "Because," he said, "by the time I knew, I had already begun to prefer the version of events that included you." She swallowed. "I was sent," she said, "by Lady Charlotte to make you hate her before the wedding, so that you would withdraw the engagement on your own terms, and she could be free to be with someone she loved." "I know that too," he said. She blinked. "How?" "The housemaid in the garden, the ribbon," he said, a very faint, almost smile. "You are not a subtle woman, Cecilia. You are many extraordinary things, but subtle is not among them." She felt the warmth of his voice on her name, her actual name, her own name. "I told you I loved someone else," she said. "I lied. I said everything was a mistake. I said the garden was. I told you it wasn't real." "I know that too," he said. "And you still—" "Yes, Why? Her voice cracked slightly on the word. She hated it and pressed forward. You knew I had deceived you for weeks. You knew I was. I am a maid, Nathaniel. I am a housemaid from Yorkshire. I have nothing. I am nobody that the world would look at and say, that is who the Duke of Ravenscar chose. I am so far beneath you that— Stop! The word was quiet and absolute. He crossed the room toward her and stopped a few feet away, not touching, but close enough that she could see every detail of his face, the dark eyes, the strong jaw, the thing that lived behind his stillness that was not coldness at all but its opposite. An enormous banked private warmth that he spent most of his life keeping very carefully controlled. The world, he said, has a great many opinions about who I should choose and what she should bring with her. I have spent 34 years paying careful, respectful attention to those opinions. He paused. I find, he said, that I am done. She looked at him. I knew from the 8th day, he said. I knew you were a maid. I knew you were there to sabotage my engagement. I watched you try, and I watched every attempt backfire, because you are incapable of being anything other than what you actually are, and what you actually are is. He stopped. Something in his face shifted, briefly unguarded, briefly young, briefly frightened. Cecilia, you made me laugh. I had not laughed like that in years. You argued with me about Wilberforce and looked furious when I disagreed and spilled tea on Lady Pembridge and made her love you for it. You untangled ribbons for a boot girl in a servant's corridor when you were supposed to be a lady. You sat across a fireplace from me and listened to me talk about my mother as though what I was saying mattered. He stepped forward 1 inch. It was not convenient, he said quietly. I am aware of that. I am aware of exactly what this looks like to the world, and what it will cost you, and what people will say. I am asking you anyway. She looked at him. The rain was coming harder against the study window. The moor outside was disappearing into grey and wet. The fire at the far wall was very warm. What are you asking? She said. He looked at her steadily. To begin, he said honestly, with your actual name, without the borrowed dress or the assignment or anything between us except what is real. She thought about the linen corridor and the lavender smell and the floor she had sat on when she finally understood what she had destroyed. She thought about the dare in the kitchen, flirt with the first gentleman you see, and how she had gone the wrong way up the wrong staircase and opened the wrong door and fallen asleep in the wrong shirt and somehow impossibly accidentally found the right person. I spilled your champagne, she said. That first tray, the refreshments I was supposed to deliver, I left them in your room, I know, he said. I drank them. They were for someone else. Most things I value, he said, came to me originally intended for someone else. She closed the last distance between them. She took his face in both hands, her real hands, the roughened hands, the maid's hands, and she pulled him down to her and kissed him. Not soft this time, not tentative, something full and honest and long overdue, with all the weeks of pretending folded into it and all the longing she had refused to call by its name. And his arms came around her, and he held her like something he had been afraid to lose, and had not yet fully believed he had found again. When she pulled back, they were both slightly breathless. I love you, she said simply, without decoration. He pressed his forehead to hers. I know, he said very quietly. I have known for rather longer than you have. Outside, the rain came down hard on the moors. The fire burned. The old stone walls of Ravenscar Court held the warmth in, the way they had held warmth for centuries, indifferent to rank and expectation, and the world's very strong opinions about who belonged inside them. He chose her publicly. This was the part that the society pages could not stop writing about for the better part of a year. It was not a secret marriage. It was not a hasty scandal smoothed over with money and distance. It was, and this was the genuinely unprecedented element, entirely deliberate. Duke Nathaniel Vaughan, who had spent 34 years being the most correct, most composed, most impeccably respectable man in English society, chose a maid, chose her openly, with full knowledge of what people would say. In the clear-eyed way he did everything. He announced his intention to Lord Kensington. in a letter so calm and precise that Lord Kensington reportedly read it 3 times before he believed what it contained. He announced it to his own family with the same composure in a drawing room at Ravenscar Court, facing 3 relations who held very specific opinions about the Vaughan name and what it required. "I am not asking permission," he said, and then he arranged it. There were people who were horrified. There were also people, fewer than expected, because Nathaniel was a man whose approval carried considerable weight, and his manner in the face of society's horror was so completely, serenely untroubled that it made horror feel embarrassing, who quietly revised their opinions. Charlotte and Elliot Holey attended the wedding, Charlotte in deep green silk and Elliot in a new coat bought with commission money, both of them wearing the slightly dazed expressions of people for whom things have worked out against all reasonable expectations. Mrs. Foley, the housekeeper at Thornwick Hall, was heard to say that she had known from the very beginning that Cecilia Roberts was going to cause extraordinary trouble, and she considered herself entirely vindicated. The wedding was in spring, Thornwick's estate church, small and old, with white flowers on every pew. Nathaniel, waiting at the end of the aisle, with an expression that was absolutely controlled and absolutely transparent, to anyone who looked carefully, the expression of a man managing the profound weight of relief. She walked toward him in ivory silk, her own this time, chosen by her, paid for with a generosity she was still privately learning to accept without guilt, and she thought about all the wrong turns that had led her here. The wrong staircase, the wrong corridor, the wrong door, the right shirt. He took her hand. "You are late," he said. His voice was low and for her alone. 3 minutes, she said. "I am never late." The world simply moved slowly on its axis this morning. The corner of his mouth shifted. The priest began. Years later, several years, in the happy, uncountable way of time that has finally gotten it right, she would steal one of his shirts in the morning, not because she needed it, not because she was cold, simply because she could, because it was large and soft and smelled like cedarwood and him, and because she liked the expression on his face when he found her in it, exasperated and entirely delighted in equal measure. "That is the 3rd time this week," he said, in the doorway of their room at Ravenscar Court, watching her read in the window seat in his white linen, morning light on the moors behind her. "Evidence," she said, without looking up from her book, "that I have not changed." "No," he said. He crossed the room, sat beside her, took the book gently from her hands and set it aside. "You have not." He said it the way she had heard him say every important thing, quiet, unhurried, completely certain. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the moor was silver gold with morning. Inside, the fire was warm, and Cecilia Roberts, who had never learned to say no, who had climbed the wrong staircase and opened the wrong door and fallen asleep in a shirt that did not belong to her, leaned her head against the shoulder of the Duke of Ravenscar, and thought that some mistakes were quite possibly the best things that had ever happened to her. And that is the story of the clumsy maid who woke in a duke's shirt and somehow ended up stealing his heart along with it. If this story kept you company today, if it made you laugh or made your heart ache or made you believe even slightly in the idea that the right persons might be behind the wrong door, then leave a like before you go. It takes 1 second and it means everything. Share this with someone who deserves a good love story today, because everyone does. And if you are new here, subscribe right now, because I tell these stories every week, and I do not want you to miss a single one. Now tell me something, because I read every comment, every one without exception. Where in the world are you watching from today? And has a wrong turn ever, even once, led you somewhere unexpectedly right? Drop it below. I will be there. Until next time.